There we go. So, like I said, this is the first of our winter lectures of the Cork Jewish community, and I have the very great pleasure of introducing David Goldberg for the first of those, and he will be talking about his family and the journey they made from accidental journey, I think even they made from Lithuania to Ireland, and how they stayed there. So I will just hand over to David, who knows what he's doing, and I'll spotlight him for everybody so we can see him. There we go. Go on, David.
Thank you, Sophia, and hello to everybody from so many different parts. It's really wonderfully exciting for me, and it's a great privilege and honor to be invited to deliver this lecture, and I'm looking forward to doing it. So the lecture is entitled The Voyage of an Immigrant from Lithuania to Limerick, and it's the story of my grandfather and my antecedents. And it's also a story about my father, who was Gerald Goldberg, and it's about what he said, the stories that he told, because he told stories about his father's voyage and his life in Limerick over and over again throughout his life. He told these stories in lectures that he gave. He told them in press interviews, in radio interviews, and television interviews, and there were quite a lot of them. And I will quote from one or two in addition to what I'm going to show you now. And this I'm going to show you. We've got a screen share. Well, before I do that, I'm going to tell you that the lecture really falls into three parts. The first part is about where they came from, who we are and where we came from. We are Lithuanians, Litvaks, like probably most of you are Litvaks. My family came from a shtetl called Lithuania, called Akmian, which is right up on the northern western border of Lithuania, on the Lithuanian side of the Latvian border. And I will talk about Akmian, I will talk about life in Akmian, I will talk about the kind of village that it was, how they tried to make a living, and I will talk a bit about the antecedents. And when I've got to the end of that section, I will then talk about the voyage. The voyage is really interesting. To some extent, I'm doing a little bit of speculating because I don't have any records or any factual information, any actual information that I can rely on, any primary sources. But what I've put together is based upon historical information, what the historians have told us over the years. And I will also contrast that with what my father said, because this is where it gets interesting and it's where it gets complicated. And then, having discussed the immigration and the voyage, the arrival in Ireland is also an interesting bit of cultural memory. Now, let me explain that phrase and another phrase called historical memory before I go any further. Cultural memory is what historians call myths, and historical memory is what historians call fact, true fact. And these two expressions come from two great writers, Robert Alter and Ronald Hennell. So I'm adopting those two. When I say cultural memory, I mean the stories that people told. And you probably all have heard the same story that I'm going to tell you anyway. So at the end of all of that, I will then review a little bit about one of the stories that they told us why they came, what made them leave Lithuania. I'll go into that in a little bit. I will tell you some of the stories that other people have told in their biographies and autobiographies. I'll just quote a couple of examples of that. And then when we get to Limerick, I will tell you my father's version of the arrival and what I think actually happened. So I'm going to begin now with a video clip of my father talking to a man called Andy O'Mahony on Radio Television Éireann in 1981. This is a very short clip, but I believe that it will give you, it will set up the stories that we're going to tell and why I'm investigating all of this. And I'm investigating it because these are the stories that Gerald told. And I wondered, are they true? Are these stories got any factual basis to them whatsoever? Or is there another version? And I looked at what the historians have said, and I will tell you what they have to say about it. So let me just share this with you. It's very short. Okay.
Present community is entirely composed of the descendants of Lithuanian Jewish refugees who came here in or about 1875. My maternal grandmother arrived in Cork in that year. My father, who was a conscript in the Russian army and didn't answer the draft, he arrived here in 1882. He was on his way to America and he was put ashore in the port of Cork and told that America was the next parish, but he never got there. And then those who found themselves stranded here, and they were stranded, they went to work, and ultimately they brought over not only their own families, but the entire village in which my father was born.
Now, stop screen sharing. Yeah. Oh, that worked, Sophie. Now, I want to tell you about Acmean. Before I tell you about Acmean, I want to tell you, my grandfather's name was Louis Goldberg. He was, in Hebrew, his name was Yehuda Leib ben Shimon HaKohen. And I was told about 30 years ago when I met a lady who was born in Cork and said she knew him. And she said he was always called Laban. So I'm going to call him Laban. And in the book that I've tried to write, I call him Laban. Now, his father was a man named Shimon. So let's go back to the screen. Let me screen share again. All right, come on. All right. Ew, what's happening there? Oh, I have to
Press on the from beginning.
Yeah, press slideshow from beginning.
There we are, that's it.
Okay, so this is my grandfather Laban. It's the only photograph I have of him. And by coincidence, I did some research on him last week, and I discovered that his yurt site was actually last Friday. And for the first time in my life, I had yurt site for him. Now, an austere-looking man, I would have thought. I don't think I look like him. I probably look much more like my grandmother. Now, how do I get back to, yeah. This is my grandmother on the right. Her name was Rachel, and my mother, Sheila, is on the left. I'm afraid it's not a very big photograph, but that'll give you some idea. And if I go back, so what I'm going to show you here is a map of all the shtetl in Lithuania. Now, unfortunately, when you take a screenshot, which I didn't do, and I'm obliged to Mick Fitzgerald for doing this and helping me with it, but he said, when you do this, you're going to get trimmings and things are going to be cut. So Acmean is up here. Can you see the arrow? Acmean is up there somewhere just under that line. And in fact, I have got another map with a printout of that. Now, just about there is Acmean. And over here is another place which you're going to refer to, Liepaja. That's the port of Latvia. So what you can see on this map is that Lithuania was covered in shtetl. There were a very large population of Jews living in Lithuania at the time. So let's go back to the family. Louis's father was Shimon Goldberg. He had two daughters and a son by a first marriage. I have no idea what happened to his wife. I don't know what her name was, and I don't know the names of the daughters or son. He then married a young girl called Elke Karlin from Zagaz. Zagaz is actually quite near. It's like, can I go back? No? I can't go back.
Press the arrow keys.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
There we
So
go.
the Zagaz is sort of around here somewhere. Yeah. He married Ellie Carlin. She was about 15 years of age, apparently, when he married her. They had 5 children: Rachel Bera Bernard, Louis Laban, Jeremiah was Yerochim, and Saul was Solomon. And on this screen, I have possibly Samuel, but I think now that Samuel and Jeremiah are one and the same person. So what did Shimon do for a living? A very common occupation for Jewish people in Lithuania at the time was they kept schenken. And a schenk is a inn or tavern or a pub. So the Goldbergs were publicans. And all of these structures were made of wood. And there were a lot of marauding gangs in and about these towns. And at one stage, Shimon's Schenken was burnt down. This was not uncommon. They could have been burnt down from fire hazard causes, or they could have been set by some group of people. There was a lot of tension between Jews and Christians at the time. There were gangs, there were fights inside the Schenken and outside the Schenken in the streets. So the family were in a bad way when the Schenk was burnt down. And then a few years after that, Shimon died. And that left Ellie in a fairly serious position. Although my aunt Fanny Marcus, in her unpublished manuscript, said that Ellie came from a fairly prosperous family, that her trousseau was substantial and was not purchased in Acmean. I don't know anything more than that. Fanny also said that the Schenken was burnt down by the Cossacks, but it couldn't have been burnt down by the Cossacks because they were in the south of Russia until, somebody mute, please. Somebody mute. The Cossacks were in the south of Russia and didn't come north until 1914. So it couldn't have been the Cossacks. In any event, after Shimon died, probably before 1880, in or about there, Ellie sent her daughter Rachel to be apprenticed to a dressmaker. She sent her son Bera to be apprenticed to a builder, and she sent Louis out as a peddler. Jeremiah, I have no information about, and Saul was too young. As you know, another commonplace occupation for Jews in Lithuania and all over Eastern Europe was peddling. And they peddled for the simple reason that they didn't have any fixtures, they had no fittings, no realty. So they could wrap all their goods into a blanket, a sheet, throw it over their backs, and when they were expelled, they could run. And that was why they kept, why they peddled. So Lithuania was a land of wood, and here is a house which is classic of the time. Well, we might have lived in that house or a similar house, and they look pretty impoverished, don't they? Pretty bleak. So let me just tell you something about the actual village. It's on the banks of the Debicine River, which is a tributary of the Venta River. And the village is described as being very poor, probably heavily forested. And it was also described as being very beautiful. These houses were very small, the doors were low, sometimes the entrances were below ground level. Gerald said that the house was on the outskirts of the town. I don't know. And the interior was partitioned off so that you had a bedroom for Shimon and Ellie, you had a bedroom for the girls, and the boys slept in the living area. And these two photographs show traditional Lithuanian stoves. You can see the cooking aperture, but at the back of it, on the picture on the left, you see a ladder up, a curtain and a mattress, and they slept on these ranges. That probably was the warmest bed in the house. And if you look at the picture on the left, just on the right-hand side of that stove, you can see a door jamb that leads into another room. Now, the stoves were kept burning all winter because, as you know, in Lithuania, the winters are very severe. So they had plenty of heat. And then you have other buildings in the village. There was a Catholic church. There were houses, there were shops, there were warehouses, and there was a market square, and there was a synagogue in the market square. More than likely it was in the market square. Acmean was permitted to have 4 fairs per year. All of these shtetls, they survived on having fairs, and all the people from the surrounding shtetl, they came on horse-drawn wagons into the village to sell their wares. They consisted of cobblers, tailors, carpenters, wagon makers, and other tradesmen. And they brought their produce in to sell. And then other people came in to buy, and there was jostling and pushing and shoving. And people went and felt the produce, they felt the chickens, they felt the eggs, they felt the leather and the wood. And then they bargained as best they could. When they didn't get a deal, they walked away, and then there was rows and shouting. And then they turned around, they walked back, and they negotiated again. And then they walked away again, they came back again, and then they made a deal. So they spat on their hands, and then they went to the shank for a celebratory glass of beer, vodka, or brandy. And there was also matchmaking, and there was also dispute resolutions in the village. So everything revolved around the market day, and it was a fixture by which all dates were determined. And the dates of the markets were determined by the Catholic liturgical calendars. One other very important fact about Lithuania was that it was full of yeshivas, or yeshivot. And the boys at the age of 9 or 10, they were sent to the yeshivot. And if they did well, they were kept. And if they didn't do well, they were sent to the cobbler or the carpenter. And a description of that is given by my uncle in a paper. He says it was a rough life where you were beaten and you were made to do all the hard work, the heavy work, the dirty work. You got very little food, no thanks, and a lot of beating. So that was really one of the things that the boys and the family would have done. They would have gone to yeshivot and they would have attempted to study, but they weren't able to because Shimon had died and they had to go to work. So when Laban was about 13 years of age, perhaps a little bit older, he declared to his mother, well, I think this wasn't quite a declaration, but it was arranged that he was going to leave Lithuania and go to Limerick to a relative called Moshe Greenfield. Now, the exodus from Lithuania started in about 1860. It gathered pace around the late 70s, and it continued to about 1914, 1920. When Russia inherited or took over the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania in the late 18th century, they inherited about 2.5 to 3 million Jews. And the people who left Lithuania were in fact the Jews, mostly the Jews, not all Jews. A lot of Catholics left too. And the Jews left and they were on their way, a lot of them were on their way to America, and many of them did make it to America, about 2.5 million. And about 500,000 arrived into the islands that we are on, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. And some of them settled here, and some of them made the onward journey to the United States. They also went to South Africa, to Palestine, to Canada, to Australia. Now, why did they leave? Well, Gerald has told the story, and you've heard him tell the story, that his father was a draft dodger. He was on his way to America when the captain put him ashore in Cove, the port of Cork. So what is the truth of this? Why did they leave? I'll say a little bit about conscription in a minute. I won't say much about it, but I'll say a little bit about it. Professor Hasia Diner, who's written a really brilliant paper on this, she says the Jews emigrated from the absolutely bleak economic prospects made worse by the May laws of 1882, but not created by them. The timing of migration, based on gender, occupation, and class, all pointed to the movement as a deliberate and rational choice, taken in the face of grim realities that staying put involved. The young were chosen first, and those in the peddling trade. So they left because making a living in Lithuania, in the shtetl, was extremely difficult, and it was very bleak. In 1873, the railroad was laid from the south of Ukraine all the way through Lithuania, through Latvia, to the port city of Liepāja. Now, the port city of Liepāja was known as Libau, L-I-B-A-U, in that time. The effect of the railway was to decimate the development of Acmean. It enabled cheap imports to be brought in, and it reduced the opportunities for sales and for the other occupations that they engaged in. And there were too many people trying to eke out a living where the economy was really not very strong. Now, the voyage is a slightly complicated story. So I've told you one version of what Gerald said. Here's a slightly different version of what he said. My father was a draft dodger on his way to America. When the ship docked in Cove, the master of the vessel told the passengers they were in the next parish to America, and they had to disembark. Gerald then tells the story about a man called Itzamarkas, who went down to Cove whenever there was a ship coming in from Russia, and particularly from Riga. And he waited on the quayside and inquired if there were any Jews on board. Okay, so that's an interesting story. Let me examine it a little bit. there are a few things that don't work about that story. The first thing is that Riga is not a port from which the ships sailed. They all sailed from Libau. Libau was a very busy port. There were timber and grain ships, and there were also cattle ships going backwards and forwards to England. The ships were mostly run by Jews, and they sold what are called combination tickets. In the shtetl, you could buy them. You could buy a train and boat ticket in your shtetl, and they were quite competitive because there seems to have been quite a lot of boats. And I inquired from a historian and an expert in this area named Nick Evans in Hull University. And he said to me, no ship ever, ever, ever sailed from Russia or Eastern Europe into Ireland, never mind Cork. He posited it was more likely than not that as the train ran quite close to Acmean, that he took the train to Libau. Gerald and Fanny Marcus said they didn't need passports, but again, that is refuted by the historians. They could get passports in Libau without too much difficulty. They had to do some arranging when they were there. And I discovered this week something that Gerald said and I didn't know, was that Laban did not travel alone. He traveled with a boy called Louis Tevye Klein. I know nothing about him. It was the first time I ever heard his name, was when I discovered this last week. There's an alternative possibility, but it's unlikely, that they went by train through Poland, through Germany, to the east of Germany, to the ports of Bremerhaven, which is the port city of Hamburg. They could have done that, but I reckon that it would have been very expensive to take a boat from Bremen even to Cork. It's possible that the boats from Bremen, because they were transatlantic, that they did stop in Cove to pick up supplies, take on passengers, and to drop off passengers. That's possible. One story that Gerald and Fanny Marcus told was that Laban had red hair, or fair hair, and he was on a train, and when it crossed the border, the train stopped and the border guards got on, and they took off any boys that they thought looked Jewish. But because Laban had red or fair hair, they didn't lift him. That would suggest to me, if there was truth in that story, and I think that's a cultural memory, but if it was true, it would suggest that they took the route via Poland and Germany and Bremen, because it's the only border that they could have crossed. When they went from Lithuania into Latvia, it was all part of the Russian Empire, so there was no border crossing. So Laban gets to Libau, with or without Louis Klein, Louis Klein, and he's on a boat and he sails probably to Hull. Alternative ports could have been London, it could have been Leith in Scotland, or it could have been West Hartlepool. But Nick Evans thinks it's more likely than not that he got to Hull. It's possible that he was met there because there were charities and there were groups of people set up to meet incoming immigrants. There was a big group of them in London and quite probably in Hull as well. And he might have stayed in Leeds for a very short time, or he might have gone on to Manchester and stayed there. We think it most likely that he actually took a boat from Liverpool or Holyhead to Dublin. He was in fact going to Limerick. And here again, the story gets a little more complicated by what Gerald said. And here's a very interesting cultural memory. And Gerald's cultural memory is that when he got off the boat in Cork, he was met by Itza Marcus. He was brought to the house of the Soundlers, who lived in Hibernian buildings in Elizabeth Terrace, which is now known as Jewtown. He may have rested up there for a few days. And then Gerald said he walked to Dublin to buy a peddler's license. And he slept rough on his way to Dublin. Now, Cork to Dublin is 160 miles. I reckon if you were walking, it could take you anything from 10 to 20 days. You'll have to bring food with you. Well, they have to bring food with them anyway, wherever they came from. Some farmers, people may have sheltered them in barns or even given them a room or a floor to sleep on. You know, it's all possible, but I think it's highly unlikely. One reason why I think it's particularly unlikely is because in 1888, Laban was summoned to the Petty Sessions Court in Limerick because he didn't have a certificate. This means he didn't have a peddler's license. Now, according to Gerald, as he said in the first clip I showed you, he came in about 1882, possibly. So if he was here in 1882 and he walked to Dublin to buy a peddler's license, then why did he not have a peddler's license in 1888? Which suggests to me that he didn't have a peddler's license and he never bought a peddler's license. They were not averse to doing things like that. There were cases where, I don't know if it was Laban or some other member of the Limerick community, was caught on a train without a ticket, and he was summoned to court. But these people were not, you know, they weren't averse to being in court, and they weren't shy about being in court, either as plaintiffs or as defendants. So the other story about Laban arriving in Dublin, and this is a story that was told to me by Sandy Hotz, who now lives in Australia. She's from South Africa. And she's a friend of the granddaughter of a man called Zelig Zaxon. You know that Zaxon was a common name and it was changed to Jackson. There's a family of Jacksons in Cork as well. So Zelig Zaxon seemingly loaned Laban some money, and then he made his way, well, I think he made his way to Limerick. Gerald said he walked back to Cork. He had bought goods to sell as a peddler. And when he got back to Cork, he rested for a day or two, and then he walked to Limerick. I have to say, I think the reality is that Laban, when he got to Dublin, met Zelig Zaxon, made his onward journey to Limerick, where he was taken in by Mausha Greenfield, who lived in 1 Westland Street. Before I talk to you about Limerick, Gerald said that when the ship landed in Cove, Laban went to see the master of the vessel, and he said to him, "When is the boat proceeding onwards?" And the master said to him, "It's not proceeding any further. This is the next parish to New York." Gerald says this conversation took place in Lithuanian. Gerald also said that Laban spoke 6 languages. So what were the 6 languages? Polish, Lithuanian, Yiddish was his first language, Russian, English, and possibly German. I think it's highly unlikely that he did speak 6 languages. One reason why I think he didn't speak Lithuanian, well, 2 reasons. Acmean was given as a present by a general to his wife in about 1800. and he was a Russian general. It's almost certain that Lithuanian was not the spoken language of the street, but Russian was. The historians, and there's 3 of them, say that only 2% of the Lithuanians spoke Lithuanian language. So I think it's very unlikely that Laban spoke Lithuanian. So now I want to tell you that these cultural memories were a constant narrative in Gerald's talks and interviews. He told everyone about conscription. Let me say just a very brief word about conscription. Gerald said when he used the word conscription, he meant that they were conscripted into the army for 25, 30 years. They couldn't keep kosher. They couldn't get out of the army. They couldn't go home. It was a living death. Conscription of that type was introduced by Nicholas I in 1827 when he succeeded Alexander I. One interesting aside about Nicholas is that his favorite occupation as a child was playing with toy soldiers. Nicholas introduced this rigid, horrible regime of conscription. He reduced it from 25 years to 15 years in 1834. And he accepted petitions from the Jewish communities that the recruits should be treated properly and the religion should be respected. And he appointed rabbis to them. Not all the generals of the brigades and the quarters where they were friendly to the Jews, and some of them didn't necessarily observe what Nicholas had decreed. But Nicholas died in 1855. And when he died, he was succeeded by Alexander II, who reformed the conscription. Conscription continued certainly up to his death in 1882 when he was assassinated. And when he changed the rules of conscription, it became an infinitely shorter period of time, and it was universal, it was applied to everybody equally, without rancor, without favor. So when Gerald referred to conscription, he was conflating it with the time of Nicholas I. And that is really cultural memory too. All of these stories are told everywhere. The stories that I've been telling you, you probably know them. I'm sure you've heard many of them before, because these are universal Litvak stories. I talked to people in Johannesburg a couple of months ago, and we shared the same stories, exactly the same stories. Just to give you some examples of 3 other people who told these stories. I'm quoting from a historian called David Cesarini. He says, by telling and retelling these stories, they were creating and transmitting group memories, establishing and preserving a sense of community, but it was also preserving a sense of self. He said, these myths are true in that they comprise the reality by which people live. They function in answer to felt needs, and they were generated within a field of social forces. So I have to say to you, Gerald didn't make these stories up. They were not lies or embellishments. They were genuinely held beliefs. And there were many variations told in biography and memoir. This is one from Jack Kaplan in Glasgow, 1926, said that his parents were immigrants from Lithuania who, like many thousands of victims of anti-Semitism, were compelled to flee from pogroms, the burning, killing, and raping permitted and encouraged by the corrupt Russians. This is a quotation from Ephraim Siv, the father of Israel Siv, co-founder of Marks and Spencer's. What's happened? Oh, okay. Sorry, I forgot to turn it off. Ephraim Siv's son Israel was the co-founder of Marks and Spencer's. Ephraim left his village near Kovno to avoid conscription. He also mentioned pogroms. The violence so scared him that he was perpetually frightened, even in England, in Leeds. The pogroms were fresh in his mind. Elaine Blond, the daughter of Michael Marks, the other half of Marks and Spencer's, was born in Slonim, 1864, and she wrote, as a teenager, he was caught up in the terror of the pogroms like thousands of his compatriots who were made the scapegoat for Russia's chronic economic and social ills. The best he could hope for was a future as an army conscript. Cesarini, I turned it off. Cesarini says at that time there were no pogroms in Slonim. Now, I have to tell you that in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, the historians say there were no pogroms in Lithuania, particularly because the head of security, General Turtelben, refused to allow any violence or escalation of violence. There were skirmishes, there were fights, there was anti-Semitism. Yes, there was degrees of persecution, but there were no pogroms. So let me go back to screen share. I have to hit something. What do I hit, Sophie?
There we go.
I've got it.
Yes.
Okay. So we'll pass from that. We'll pass from that. So here we are in Limerick, just before I go into the end of this talk. The house on the left is the old synagogue. It's number 63 Collooney Street, as it was then. It's now Wolfe Tone Street. Before it was a synagogue, it was a barracks. And when we went down, when Carla and I went down in August to do a reconnoitre of Limerick, we met the people who live in the house, a lovely couple called Sylvia and Tom Hogan, and they invited us in. And downstairs, there's a very narrow hallway which leads to a kitchen at the back. On the right and left, where you see the windows, there are two small rooms. They would have been very good for minyan or for committee meetings or council meetings or whatever. The shul was upstairs. It's now bedrooms, so we didn't see that. But the original stairs is in the house, and that's actually quite lovely. The house on the right is in Collooney Street. It's one of the houses where Laban lived. He lived in many houses in and around Collooney Street and in and around Limerick. The one on the bottom right is number 47 Henry Street, and that's a house where he also lived. The house on the left is number 67 Henry Street. This is a house where he lived the last house he lived in. And he by then had quite a substantial family, a growing family. He was also sharing the house with his brothers-in-law. They had a servant who helped in the house. So there was quite a lot of them living there. He also had a shop in the house. And Laban, after he succeeded as a peddler, he went into wholesale drapery. And he also opened a grocery shop in the house. Now, Ellie was very much the part of running the shop. She helped him. Rachel helped a bit, but she was looking after very small children. The house on the right-hand side of this picture was occupied by a relative called Baron, and then they moved out. Another relative called David Weinronk moved in. I actually should tell you that the family name Goldberg is not our family name at all. Our family name is Weinronk, if you go back far enough. And at a time when names were changed, some kept the name Weinronk or Weinronk, and then Shimon took the name Goldberg. Another brother took the name Baron, and I think Greenfield might have been a brother too, but I don't know for sure. So what do the historians say? Well, Laban, by the way, he was quite successful, from what I can gather, as a businessman. He raised a large family, and I think he did very well. Later in life, he went into scrap metal and other goods, and he continued with drapery. So I'm coming to the end of this. What the historians say. Professor Diner says, in all the accounts, the immigrants dazed, tired, ignorant, and impecunious, not only had no idea where they were going, but by necessity had to be leaving something horrendous rather than going towards something more positive. Actually, that's not correct, because they had newspapers in Yiddish and Russian. They had correspondence with people who were overseas, and they did know where they were going. She continues, those who came to Ireland, and there's no reason to assume that any somehow landed there by accident or chicanery, did so because they saw in John Bull's other island the prospect for economic success. They learned that in Ireland a living could be had, whereas in Lithuania it could not. Here they could go into business in particular peddling. And one historian, then called Cormac O'Grada, who wrote a book called Jews in the Time of Joyce, specifically mentions Louis. He calls him Louis. Given, however, that the 11-year-old Louis Goldberg was at first sheltered by relatives who had settled in Limerick and would marry into a Litvak family that had been in Cork since 1875, surely a straightforward economic interpretation of his immigration is more probable. The reasons for immigration was because the economic situation in Lithuania was extremely bad. And they were all economic migrants, without any doubt about that. But why, and I will end on this, why did Gerald perpetuate these stories? He told them all through his life, with very slight variations. I don't know whether you know who Lord Sachs was, Chief Rabbi of United Kingdom, Rabbi Lord Sachs. He gave a wonderful talk in 2017. He said, "We are immigrants, and we must tell our stories of who we are and why. The identity is created by telling the story. It is learned from ancestors and books and passed on. Then the story becomes reality, and it begins to imitate literature. The story is told to make the teller strong so that he can withstand the tribulations of a very hard and painful emigration. When he arrived in Ireland, Laban didn't have time to dwell on where he came from, what he had left behind. He had to start working immediately and learning English. Great resources of strength are necessary to make the transition from one place to another. Identity provided that strength, that inner strength. And I'm going to finish on these quotations as another explanation as to why Gerald kept telling these stories. He was quite religious. He was Orthodox. He knew his way around the Torah. He knew his way around the Psalms and all the liturgy. He could daven and so forth. Deuteronomy 29:14 says, "And not with you alone do I seal the covenant and this oath, but with him who is standing here with us, and this day before the Lord our God, and with him who is not with us here today." That was transposed into the Haggadah, where it says, when we recount the story of Exodus, we should remind ourselves that we and each of us were among those people who came from that country. So Laban came out from Lithuania. He brought his whole family with him. They were here before 1891 when he was married. And I think that Gerald felt that he had come with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Do you want to stop the screen sharing?
Yeah.
There we go.
Wow.
Would you like to take some questions? I don't know if people have them. But
It's very easy.
so if you have questions,
Rudy. No.
yeah, Rudy says, well told, David, indeed.
Yeah.
Rob raised his hand, so if you want to ask your question.
Yes, compared to other countries, I've been told that Ireland has very, very little incidence of anti-Semitism over its history. Is that true?
Generally speaking, it is true. Generally speaking, with an exception in Limerick in 1904. But by and large, there has been very little anti-Semitism. There is more anti-Semitism at the moment, but it is in the form of anti-Zionism or anti-Israel.
Thank you.
And then Howard
Hard.
Sofska. Hey.
Hi. So, David, that was wonderful. A question, you know, it's estimated that within the United States, the immigration to the United States, and there were like 2 million people from Eastern Europe that came here between 1880 and 1920. It's estimated that there was a reverse immigration and about 10% of the people went back. Was there any knowledge, do you have any knowledge of a reverse immigration from, Ireland, from Eastern Europe to Ireland and going back?
No, I don't have any information of that, and I'm not aware of it. I can tell you a story of a man called Meyer Wigador, whose house was burnt down in Vixnia. And he went to Amsterdam. He had family and friends there. And he tried to make a go of it in Amsterdam, and it didn't work. So he came on to Ireland, where he knew people, and he was quite successful in Ireland. So I don't know about people going back. Yeah, maybe they did.
We have a question from Susie, and she wants to know who Laban married.
Laban married Rachel Sandler. Rachel was brought over to Cork from Acmean in 1875, and she was 1 year old. And they lived in 14 Elizabeth Terrace in Hibernian Buildings in Cork. And they had, by the way, yeah, Rachel had a total of 13 pregnancies. Of 13, 8 survived. 4 died, 3 died in infancy, 1 died about the age of 4 or 5, and the other died at the age of 24. It was sad. Any other questions? The 15 in the chat room, what do they say? I don't know. No, type of message made from it. She found it really interesting too.
David, can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course, Mick.
Yeah. You mentioned the gentleman asked a question about anti-Semitism in Ireland, and I just wanted to say, it seems to me, and Gerald is a good example, the Jews who came to Ireland were quite political. They were spread across the various parties. And do you think that to a certain degree might have diluted what could have been worse. Because I know Gerald was a very prominent politician for several parties, and he became the first Lord Mayor of Cork, Jewish Lord Mayor of Cork as well.
Yeah, but there, I don't think that's why. I think anti-Semitism is just a universal and rampant, hideous thing.
No, I didn't want to talk about that. I just wanted to refer to the fact that Jews were quite prominent politically in this country.
But only recently.
Well, Gerald goes back a while. And so does...
You know,
So does... So do...
1967.
Yeah, but so did the Briscoes.
Yeah, but Bob Briscoe was in the Dole, I don't know, quite a long time.
Yeah.
And it followed by his son, Ben. Here's a description. Here's a description which Fanny Marcus gave in her memoir. And she's talking about the men going out to work in Limerick, the Jews going out to work in Limerick. And there was antagonism quite clearly in Limerick. Even before 1904, there were some serious incidents. And this is her description. Each man had a backpack on each shoulder. They were out in all weathers. There was no slack. They had families to feed and to put bread on the table. They often went through the streets with their back bent, followed by children shouting at them, "A pitchy man, a tally man, a Jew, Jew, Jew." No.
There's a question from, I don't know your name, you have it down as 079166. So you have a raised hand. Go ahead.
That's I think that's us. I'm Cyril Newman. I live in Dublin, and thank you very much for your telling your family's story. My family story is very similar. They also lived in Acmeyan, and I used to ask my father as much as I could as a young boy to tell me about it. He said to me one day, he said, "Well, Acmeyan, it was a small place. Do you know Swords?" And this was in the 1950s. I said, "Yes, we've passed through there." He said, "Yes, well, Acmeyan was smaller than Swords." So that was the first thing. I still have the passport that they came on. My father came with his parents and his two sisters in 1907 when he was 10. His two brothers were in Ireland before that, but I don't know exactly when. It states in the passport that it was written in Russian, German, and in French, so I could have that translated. They came through the port of Danzig to Cork. And when they came to Cork, they lived in Hibernian buildings, which in my imagination was at least 3 stories high and consisted of several apartments. Nächtigentag, it was a little terraced cottage that they lived in. And then they moved from there to number 4 Tuckey Street. My grandfather, whose name was Itzik Nairman, they changed the name to Newman, and he gave his occupation in Acmeyan as a bookbinder. Now, I couldn't imagine, Acmeyan was a tiny place. How the hell did he make a living as a bookbinder? But they were all duckers and weavers. And when they came to Cork, they somehow got into the picture framing business. They were framing holy pictures, and my father went out as a peddler. They all worked in that business. And then in 1916, they left Cork and they came up to Dublin. We went back about 14 years ago to Acmena to see what it was like. There is no trace of the Jews ever having lived there, except for the Bethlehem, the cemetery. And these gravestones there had weathered and they were impossible to read. Lithuania, I asked him, why did they ever leave? He said to me, they left because they were putting boys of 12 into the army and they had to serve for 25 years. They were all sent very far away from home, so they lost any knowledge of Yiddishkeit, and that was like murder to any of them. So that was why they left, and also for, I'm sure, for economic reasons. So that is my family's story. His mother was a Zax. She also came there to Cork and related. They changed the name to Jackson. So I have a lot more research to do. But thank you very, very much for your wonderful story.
Could I thank you very much, Cyril, and lovely to see you and Pat. Yeah, we share the same story, obviously. But can I just say welcome to, this is a wonderful occasion. Welcome to Sandy Hotz from Australia, who must have got up at 6 in the morning or something to come online. And can I also say hello to 2 friends of mine in Moscow. So we're going across the globe today, which is really quite exciting. And I think we've got a lot of people in America.
Wonderful.
It's wonderful, really wonderful. I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled. So thank you very much indeed.
Gerald, when you mention about anti-Semitism, you mentioned the story of Limerick and the pogrom there. That is why so many people from Ireland at the time went to South Africa. But I remember your father talking in his television interview, in the film, and talking to him that the fear of anti-Semitism just about the time of the war, because Irish government was so sort of anti-English, anti-England and Britain, that they might possibly have had to put you somewhere because they thought they might be taken off, siding with the Germans. So, I don't know how much the community felt at that time, or if you have any recall of that yourself.
Well, the figures, Sandy, for the exodus from Limerick, well, that 91 people left and 96 people left and 121 stayed. It's nearly half the community. It was a bit under half the community. It was a terrible event, terrible. It must be absolutely terrifying. But I'm not going to talk about it now. That's another chapter in the book. Particularly difficult one. So again, thank you all so very much for coming and tuning in and watching and listening. Thank you for your contributions and your stories and your questions. Really invigorating and very stimulating and wonderfully exciting for me to have the opportunity to do this. And thanks to Sophia and to the Cork Jewish community for sponsoring this and enabling me to do it. So thank you all very much indeed.
Of course, thank you so much, David. It was a real pleasure. And we'll try and get this up on YouTube and share it on the Cork Jewish community page, which is a Facebook page. We have a website as well, corkjewishcommunity.ie. So anyway, if you want to go to the Facebook page and like us, we'd appreciate it. But anyway, we'll put it up and we'll try and get it up on YouTube. I'm going to stop the recording now. And thank you so much on behalf of the Cork Jewish community, David, for this wonderful first session of the winter lecture. Thank you so much for all the people who came. It's really inspiring to have so many of you join from so many different areas in